Hi, welcome back to the Mom Mentality Show. My name is Austin Chadwick and co-host is Chris Lucian. And today we are excited to have Dave Copeland on the show to talk about some engaging topics here. Some things like dangers of following the literal words of Agile, aphorisms. Maybe we'll jump into some estimates and productivity, and maybe don't bet against the spreadsheet for project management. So we'll see what we get to, or we might end up somewhere else, but either way, it's totally good. And before we jump to any of those topics, Dave, can you give an introduction for yourself?
Sure. My name is Dave Copeland. I've written technical books as David Bryant Copeland. There's a Dave Copeland that writes books. It's not me. I have previously been at Living Social and was early at Stitch Fix, CTO of a mental health company for a while. I've written some books on Ruby and Rails. One of them is called Sustainable Rails, which is more like a sort of advanced how to deal with Rails after you sort of learned it, and things like that. So yeah, I've done a lot of product development at startups and big companies over the last several years, and been doing this as, I don't know, 25 some years, which is crazy, but you can see the color of my hair. So
Fantastic. Yeah, we'd love to jump into some things drawing from that experience. So yeah, I guess first up, yeah, what are your thoughts here on the dangers of following literal words from Agile, and maybe getting beyond that into nuanced meaning? What are your thoughts here?
Yeah. So at so I have done government contracting, which does waterfall. And so I was very interested in Agile when it started becoming popular. And a lot of it seems like it makes sense, like working iteratively, delivering value as soon as you can, showing the customer what you're doing before you're quote unquote done with the entire project. Seems pretty good. But I never really worked in a formalized we're going to do XP, we're going to do Scrum. I never really worked that way. I was just sort of familiar with it. So at Stitch Fix, I was pretty early. So the early team, there was maybe like 4 or 5 of us, and we didn't know each other at all. We all knew the CTO in various ways. That was our sort of link, but none of us knew each other. One of the guys had done a lot of strict Agile consulting, like we're going to pair program and XP and like by the book. He'd done a lot of that. Another guy was sort of like me. He sort of knew it, but he had just done product work and everything in between. And so we all had to figure out how to work together because it was a startup, and we were small, and so there wasn't going to be some formalized process that wouldn't have made sense, but we did have to figure out how to work together. And I just found we were arguing about what is a single responsibility or not. Like, instead of getting our work done, we're like, well, violates the single responsibility principle. And I was like, and I just saw this sort of as the company grew, depending on someone's sort of experience with Agile. Oh, you've got to dry up this code. Well, do you need to make a constant to define that 0 is 0? Like, is that really helping? And so there was just a lot of it was sort of all over the place. And I started thinking, like, when you look at these words, don't repeat yourself. Like, if you forget about all the text of the pragmatic programmer that includes that phrase, what do those 3 words mean? And should you do that? And the answer is you probably shouldn't, in general, in life, operate under the principle of not repeating yourself. Like, that's probably not good. You want to be understood. If you say something and someone doesn't catch it, hey, I don't repeat myself, right? Like, that doesn't make sense. But then in software, right, you think about it with software, it also is a little unclear because you could interpret it as there should be no duplication of data anywhere. There should be anything that's important, it should have one place. But I need to cache things to make them faster. So that means the data is in 2 places, right? I have to write a test. The test sort of duplicates kind of a little bit some of the logic. It has to come at the logical. Is that a repetition? So it just gets very confusing. And like, what are we trying to achieve? So I started thinking about all of these other ones, right? YAGNI, you're not going to need it. Okay, I get it, right? Don't make things that you don't need. But sometimes, like, I had this debate about YAGNI about writing log statements. And like, I'm going to need log statements. And on the day I need log statements is going to be 6 months from now when there's a problem. And I should have written those log statements today. So clearly something is not happening right. Like, it's not making sense. And I don't know. I would try to debate this with you. Debate maybe is a strong word. Like, we would sometimes have a meta discussion of like, what are we doing here? Does this make sense? And it was just really interesting because everyone had a different interpretation of what these things meant. And I started looking into some of them, like the solid principles. Uncle Bob has like written a lot, and you can actually find where he came up with these, and you can read a lot of the context of like why he came up with these different things. And a lot of them don't make any sense now. Like one of them was about you're shipping code on a CD in the mail, and you need to make sure that when you update that code with another CD 2 months later, it updates in this way. And so you should design your code in a certain way. I bet that made a lot of sense when we were emailing CDs out to the data center, but like that's not what we do now. So that doesn't make a lot of sense. But people's interpretation, their retcon of what they think these things mean is interesting because they all interpret it as doing something that makes sense, right? Single responsibility. It sounds like it makes sense. And if you're experienced, you're like, yeah, piece of code shouldn't do too much. But like, shouldn't do too much and single, those are different, right? Single responsibility means one, means we need to count responsibilities. And if there's more than one, we have messed up and we got to fix it. And inexperienced developers who would just kind of follow this would end up with this massively decoupled code base where everything was all over the place and there was no sort of like cohesiveness to what they were doing because they didn't know like what is the context in which we're trying to summarize it all with the phrase single responsibility principle or don't repeat yourself, right? There's a core of those things that make sense, but they get lost when you look at those like literal words. So I mean, I don't know, does that, I've talked to people about this and it sort of rings true. Does that ring true to you all as well? Have you experienced this or am I just in a different world sometimes?
Yeah. I'm curious if your thoughts, Chris. But my first thing is, I remember in actually a book behind me on the shelf back there, Refactoring to Patterns. He talks about over engineering and under engineering as two kind of like places to land, and both are bad. And what he said, Joshua Karieski, resonated with my experiences. So my very limited experiences is for every one time, it's like 99 to 1. I've seen under engineering, and maybe every once in a very great while, I see something over engineered. And
Yeah.
so, but that's a very relative statement for me in my personal experiences. Right. And so I can imagine in some circles that maybe that's flipped on its head. Things get over processed. I remember I was talking to some baseball coaches and they were talking about someone like, if you're a chef and you over process the dough and like over knead it or whatever, like, you made it worse than, if you under, if you, worked with it less kind of thing. Right. And so I think, so for me, my biases are bent towards slaying the demons of under engineering, just because I've suffered so much pain from under engineering. But I think I try to caveat that with kind of the just sharing principle, which is, here's some things that have helped in my context, which is tended to be an under engineering context, that have helped improve things, reducing responsibilities, reducing duplication when it's real duplication, not like, things that mess up coupling or cohesion and things like that. Right. And so I really liked your topic here because nuance is so true with all those things you said.
And even the just sharing thing, like it makes total sense because a lot of advice doesn't make sense depending on a context, or in another context, it's like sacrosanct, right? Like that context really matters, and it's hard to capture. It's hard to capture that in a quick little aphorism, but it is really, really important.
That's the danger with pithy statements. And so, I think like the Made to Stick book talks a lot about very short stories and they're, trying to impact people's behaviors. And so, and maybe this kind of goes back to like Linda Rising's talks and things where it's, you're appealing to people's emotions and then you're also trying to make bite-sized statements or pithy statements to like get people to behave better. And so, probably to Austin's point, my guess is that single responsibility problem has helped more than hurt, even if it was misinterpreted, often because, otherwise they're in like a 4,000 line file. So it's like, do you have 500, 40 line files, or do you have, like 1,000?
Right.
And so, But yeah, I have seen things that were overly dry, or single responsibility was interpreted at a technical level. I think in the clean architecture book, kind of the most recent Uncle Bob book, he talks about the origin of the single responsibility program principle, and he was talking about it being related to the single responsibility to an end customer, and that's what it's separated by. Versus, I think, the interpretation of like, this piece of code has a single responsibility.
Right.
And so that's like a completely different interpretation of that. And I'm not sure that I interpreted it that way when I was reading clean code way back when.
I definitely, this is the first time I'm hearing of that interpretation, and it makes a lot more sense than the one I've been using, which is like, how many methods are in your class? That's too many methods, right?
Yeah. Right. And so I think he does in that book. It's pretty good because he goes into a little bit of this topic of like what he meant when he wrote that first book, and so I found that pretty interesting. But yeah, I think I think it's good to use retrospectives, reflection, and other things to drive forward the changes that you end up making. And also lean, right? So like one of the 7 deadly wastes is overproduction or gold plating. We always yell out the gold plater, the gold finger theme, but it's gold plater instead. So whenever we see it, so yeah, I certainly agree. Like there's a lot of that there, and then there's interpretation, but really it's like all of these things maybe we should be doing in response to an obvious problem as a result of a retrospective, not necessarily, like sometimes it's okay to let it get a little bit messy in order to then reflect on it and then have a good idea of where to go with it later.
Right. Because you don't know what code is going to need to change. Well, you might have an inkling, but like if there's some messy code and it just exists for years, who cares, right? But if there's like some messy code that's like you're always in there and it's always a slog, then that's more of a problem. And that's that nuanced context that is hard to suss out. But then the other part that I find interesting about the little pithy words is like, because there's a way to interpret what I was just saying is like, well, we shouldn't say pithy things. Let's just say what we want. Yeah. And I think like in a product team where everyone knows each other and there's a lot of trust, like I think you can get past this stuff and sort of like talk about what's actually happening, and that's usually better. But a lot of companies like don't know how to operate themselves, and so they bring in these so-called agile consultants or just consultants who often have to really sell some of these concepts to people that either don't know what they are or don't understand their impact or all of that. And so these pithy things can really help, right? Like at a company I was at, I would sort of say, oh, here's some things that we need to do. And we're thinking about like microservices. And people are like, yeah. And they just didn't do them. And we hired this VP of engineering who has done a lot of public speaking and had previously been like a sort of CTO for hire consultant. And he came in and said the same thing I was saying, except in a different way. And everyone's like, yeah, like they bought it, right? So the form of the message can matter, and who you're talking to and what you need to convince them of is important. So I don't want to say like, let's throw out these aphorisms, but we got to be real about what they mean and be able to kind of go beneath them when we're getting confused,
Yeah. It's funny. Your story reminds me of one too, where I was in an organization where I shared an idea for kind of a way to improve things, and everyone hated it. And then a couple months later, they hired someone who wanted to do all the things that I said, and they did them, and they were bought in. And it was just hilarious how that happens in organizations, you know what I mean? And yeah. It's like what you said, maybe I wasn't saying in the right way, or maybe they had to hate it and disagree with it for a while, and then hear someone say it in, I don't know, C-suite speak or something, and then exactly, it helps. But yeah.
So this is what I call the reading rainbow thing, where it's like appealing to authority. So in Reading Rainbow, they would have kids talk about the books that they like, and so he would say, "Don't take my word for it," and then they would go in and say, so like sometimes you're just going to be in an environment where you're trying to convince people of something, and you have to appeal to someone, basically somebody else has to say it because there is like an expectation of you. So, and that can be, pithy statements can help people remember these things.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's just requiring them to hear it a second time from somebody else, or maybe they weren't ready to hear you that first time, but maybe the next time. And so I think throughout my career, I've found that there's often these moments where it's like, you might have been the first to say it, but the 10th person to say it is the one that actually gets listened to. Yeah.
Right. And if you hadn't said it, then maybe the whole thing wouldn't have. Yeah, you can never know. So yeah.
For sure. Yeah. So I mean, I actually am kind of curious on your thoughts on that, because this is something funny enough. Me and my wife were talking about, not in Agile. My wife will tolerate me talking about Agile a little bit, but it was more kind of in the education space, in that, with, teaching our kids things, the schools teaching our kids things. And I found a lot of similarities with Agile, or good, principles and practices and values in software engineering, is that the sweet spot of how to do something well in your context is a very nuanced thing. But when you try to share that with someone else in simpler statements, it leads to this thing that Martin Fowler called the semantic diffusion, where the meaning gets lost.
Right.
And so how do you balance that? Like, basically, I'm rephrasing your question you just said back to yourself. Like,
right.
if I'm so good at being pithy and persuasive, then people don't really come to learn the nuanced meaning, and then they misapply it, and then they're like, this doesn't work. I hate X, whatever X is. Austin said to do X, and X is terrible. I'm going to tell everyone X is terrible now.
Right. I mean, that's like the like doing it right. So like at a certain point at Stitch Fix, like I had stopped being a on the ground programmer, and I was managing other programmers, but I was reviewing a lot of code. And I definitely was falling into the trap of like telling people what not to do, or to do. Like I was sort of being very prescriptive, like overly prescriptive. And one of the senior engineers was like, dude, like you have got to like let people fail, because they're never going to learn anything. And I was like, yeah, that's probably true. And so you can tell people all day long, like, don't do X, or here's the right way to do it, or here's what that's called. But if they don't ever experience it, especially some level of failure of like, oh, that's why I should not have so many responsibilities in my class, or whatever. And so you have to let people experience it in a safe way, or be with them. And so, code review, pair programming, things like that can help, because you can be like, an experienced person can be right there, letting the less experienced person, or I don't want to say like level, the person who's learning something can be there with the person who already knows the thing, and see it for real, right? Get away from the theory and get into like, we're actually coding now, and here's where it actually matters. And we can show, okay, the single responsibility, like if we make this this class have less stuff in it, okay, we can see that that's better. Or if we go too far, we can see that that's too far, and why, and talk about it in the context of actual code that everyone's familiar with, and not just example code, right? That's always the hard thing about explaining coding things to people, is you have to give them something that's so simple they can understand the code. But then often it's so simple that you're like, why would I apply this convoluted principle to this, 4 lines of code? But you can't expect someone to like learn some huge app so you can then talk about a principle. So in an actual workplace, right, that's the perfect place to do it, because you have an actual job to get done, and everyone's as familiar as you can be with what they need to do. And so that's a good environment for learning. But it's hard to, right, you take any 2 pair of people, is one of them going to be able to explain to the other? Well, hopefully, maybe not. You don't know necessarily. Or code review, like a lot of developers don't like having their code reviewed, especially asynchronously, or they're not used to it, so it's uncomfortable. And so there's a lot of like resistance to being in it, and then you're not going to learn that way. So it takes some intention on the team of like, and you were mentioning before, like retrospectives, like those can be another thing too. You can talk about, what did we just do? What went well? What didn't go well? That can be powerful, because it's relating to something that everybody already understands, and not something theoretical. But those structures have to be in place and normalized to do, and people need to be taught to do them well, right? Like I used to do code reviews that I understand were not well received because I did not know how to explain the issues I was bringing up in a way that they were going to land. And so they weren't achieving their goal then. And I got smartened up, thankfully, but that has to exist if you want to lean on that process. Pair programming is the same way, I assume. So
Yeah, right on. And that reminds me of things I've observed kind of in recent experiences, is that it just won't happen magically, right? There needs to be, like, whatever you believe would be good for the organization, there needs to be someone experienced in, let's just call it X, someone experienced in X there to guide the team, right? And so
right.
even if you have retrospectives and good system things in place, if there's no one there to guide them and show them the nuances in that context, right? Because like you were saying before, some piece of advice could be wonderful in one context, another context would be terrible, right? And so
right.
and at least at this stage, because software engineering is in the infancy of engineering disciplines, it almost takes that experienced person to know the nuance and to guide the team, right? And so so something Chris and I talked a lot about recently is, it's almost like you need to stack the deck. Woody Zuhl is someone who was involved in the mob programming move from the beginning, and he brought Chris in to stack the deck. He'll tell the story. And so it's almost like you need to stack the deck. Each team needs someone who's experienced in the things that are needed for that context to help teach the rest of the team and guide them. And without that, I've definitely seen flailing, even with a lot of good processes like retrospectives or pairing or mobbing, or it can still go quite sideways.
Yeah, totally. If you don't know what you don't know, or you don't know who to ask, some developers, like, I work with a guy for many years, and his mindset is like, he just had a good sense of like what was an unknown that he needed to figure out before he plowed ahead. But then you have the opposite. We're like, we'll figure it out later. And like, there's there's a good and bad, times to use them. But having someone who knows and whose job it is to like say, that's a good point I'm about to make to myself, which is having someone whose job it is to do, to stack the deck. Like you said, like, your job is to go in there and make sure everybody understands these things that they don't even know they don't understand. Right. And so, like, as Stitch Fix got bigger and we had like, managers and directors, but then principal engineers and architects, we had a really hard time defining, okay, you are the principal engineer on this team. And what that means is that you're responsible for making sure everybody understands whatever like hidden technical nonsense they don't know. And like, saying that and having it actually happen was really hard, because not everyone knew what that meant, and it's always easier to like deliver your work. And so it was very hard to kind of put those structures in place, that like, your job as a senior engineer is not necessarily to write the awesome code, but to like look for what's happening and make sure that people like aren't missing things that they're not looking out for.
Yeah, for sure. And actually, I'll kick it over to Chris, because before I joined our current organization, they already set up this nice little like path forward of how to grow in the organization. And the higher tiers involved exactly what you're saying. But I'll kick it over to Chris for how that was discovered, so to speak.
Right. Yeah. So, I think there was a lot of confusion about, what it even meant to be a senior or like, principal or distinguished level software engineer. And, I think eventually one thing was that we kind of involved everyone in our promotions process. And then there was like a very confused interpretation of what we meant by this next level. And even though it was kind of like written out on the job description, it was often very hard for people to imagine, what it's like, what it is, what it really means to be a distinguished level developer or something. And so one thing we did was we made kind of like a progression or a roadmap of the different things. And so often, at the distinguished level, we talk about, we should learn negotiation, because we might have to negotiate with outside, parties outside of the department. We should, really put an emphasis on training people in kind of like a salmon coaching method, if you take the Emily Bates stuff, and a number of other things. But when we hire somebody, it's very, very clear now, I think, that a big portion of the job is to essentially be bringing up everyone around you, and then advocating for the right things in the right contexts, while for the team that they're on, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I definitely noticed at Stitch Fix that people hired into these roles, it was a little easier because you could tell them straight up, this is the job, and then they would show up and they would think that was the job, and so that helped. Like, I mean, I'll be honest, I struggled with it too, because I liked writing code and I liked reviewing code, and at a certain point, it's like, it's just making everything worse if I'm doing that, because I'm don't have the right context, and therefore I'm also not doing like my actual job, which is managing or being a higher level IC, things like that. And so it was definitely hard to see that impact from not writing code. Like, okay, how do I see the impact of what I'm doing when it's not like running a test and sending it to production and seeing it work? Like, if I'm not doing that, how do I know? And that, it was, I mean, hard for everybody to get into that, for sure.
All right,
again, it's more like nuance, right? You can't tell them exactly what it is, because you sort of need them to know what to do without right? You can't say exactly, here's your minute by minute itinerary for being a staff engineer. Like that doesn't work. So they have to understand the nuance and the context of whatever it is and figure it out. And if they don't, then it's really hard, because like, it's reasonable to say, well, you didn't tell me. Well, we're trying to get you, we need you to do it without being told. And it's just a weird, hard job to make sure people are doing well.
Yeah.
I think I think as like transitioning from a technical role into like a leadership role, I think one thing it really is, it's like wherever the bottleneck might be, right, is where you focus your time. So I think sometimes it's just like teaching how to do good retrospectives will be the most impactful thing for the team, or doing something technical, so you can do some IC stuff, but it really means that you might be finding a better way to work, because a team is experiencing a problem and they don't necessarily know like what an alternative would look like, even, right? Because so I think that people can be down in the weeds so much that you can't see the forest through the trees often. And I think that that's some of the like higher level stuff that can be done, where you can still stay technical at the same time. Or maybe it's negotiating with external partners to like figure out. It's like what I found is that I do spend a lot of time writing code, but sometimes it's like really obvious that I shouldn't be writing code, and then balancing, jumping back and forth between those things, I think it's good.
Yeah. I ended up so all the sort of principal and architect level engineers at Stitch Fix, some of them would do some of the stuff that you said. I ended up being like a technical product or project manager, because I'd been there for so long. I could be in a meeting and represent the engineering team, but then also ask stuff of the non-engineers in a way that would get an answer and not be viewed as being a bottleneck or being a jerk or getting in the way or something like that, which is just so weird, because like other people in my exact title, like they would not have been able to do that because they just hadn't been there for so long. And it was just, I mean, I'm glad I was able to do that, but it was just very, very odd to be like, okay, my job is to have a title and tenure and be in a meeting and get a result for my team out of this meeting.
Yes, for sure. Good stuff. Yeah. And maybe before we transition topics, it's kind of a cool area, because there are ways to lead and coach and write lots of code. At least in our organization, and there are ways to do less code and lead and coach. And I think I'm happy to be in the spot I'm in now, where I think I'm doing both, at least. And so it's really fun. So maybe I should transition topics, just because I'm guessing the next topic will lead to some discussion, debate, curiosity, learning from each other here a little bit here. But so you had some thoughts on estimates, and well, what's your take there?
So I think there was I'm not on Twitter anymore. I'm on Mastodon, and there's a lot of technical people there. And one of them had said something about estimates, and they were just sort of like talking about it. And it reminded me of this like no estimates movement. And I was like, what was that about? And so I went and I did a little Googling to like see what that was about. And like it seemed wild to me to be like if I'm like, I've got millions of dollars and I would like to get some software built, and you're not going to tell me how long it's going to take. Like I'm probably overgeneralizing, but like the word no estimates, that is a way you could interpret that.
Right.
And so I was like, but I've definitely given some estimates that I was held to unfairly. I've definitely been in a situation where I was like, this will take 2 weeks. It will probably take 4. And I was asked, can you do it in 1? Like I've been through all of that. So I get it. Like just shooting that into the sun, like is a way to avoid it. But the more I thought about it, the more it's like, okay, people like it is important how long something could take. So I was on the last project I worked on at Stitch Fix was our international expansion, which is basically like make everything that we have work in the UK and also possibly other countries, but like, do that. And so we get an understanding of like, okay, what do we need to do? And then the people running the company, the business, as they say, is like, all right, how long is it going to take? And so I'm like, okay, that's reasonable. But I'm like, why do you need to, first thing is like, why do you need to know that? In a way that like they knew I was asking honestly, right? Not like I'm being a jerk, but I'm like, what is the reasoning to know how long it's going to take? And like, I thought we're doing this, right? The CEO said, we're doing this. So like, does it matter how long it's going to take? They're like, well, as it turns out, you can't launch a fashion thing outside of summer or winter because of the summer season and the winter, or the spring season and the fall season. So if it doesn't launch by May 1st, then it should not and cannot launch until September 1st. I was like, okay, that makes sense. So I'm like, what I'm hearing is we need something to launch by May 1st. I'm like, yeah. I'm like, okay. And so like that was helpful because it's like, okay, I'm not going to promise you that everything is going to be done on May 1st. But what I can do is try to get a sense of what we think could be done on May 1st and then work in a way that makes the most sense so that on May 1st, we have most of it done, or at least the important stuff done. And so I talked through like, here's how I think we could do this, keeping in mind, like, I don't know, like we've never done this before. So there's no way I can tell you, but I can give you a sense of it. And I think what they wanted to know is like, they're planning, like there's stuff that happens other than the engineers building software, and that has to coordinate. And so to say that like, I can't tell you when anything is going to be done. So you people buying ads or printing up things or like hiring new staff, preparing training, you can all just chill and wait. I'll be with you later, right? Like that's not cool. You have like, there's a reason to want an estimate that's legitimate, that makes sense. And so as a developer, you need to find a way to give them an answer without screwing yourself. And that's the trick, right? And so then there's a lot of asterisks to that. And so the anecdote I was just saying, like the only reason that worked is because the company was pretty functional. I had a pretty healthy relationship with everybody. The people involved, like they understood at a fundamental level that software is like kind of unknowable. And they knew that like, it's not something that it's not the same as assembly line work. Like they understood that. So when I was able to say, we can get you something by May 1st, they understood what that meant and they trusted me. So that's a lot of stuff to exist to be able to give an estimate. But I would rather think about those things than just say, we're not giving estimates. It'll be ready when it's ready. But like I said, when we were first talking, like I haven't been a consultant in probably really ever. So I could imagine that if you're an Agile consultant, that like that, if you say we don't do estimates and you have a way to explain that, maybe that makes sense. Maybe it makes everybody feel more comfortable if they're all working a little bit at a time, especially if they don't know what they're doing. But I definitely bristle at like, oh, we shouldn't give estimates. Like you absolutely should be able to say sort of what you're doing. And some things, right? Like we got to make a web form that we validate and store in a database. I think I could probably estimate that, right? Like I've done that a few times. Like I can probably tell you within an order of magnitude, like what's involved. in doing that. And if I can, I should be able to explain why, and we should be able to get to the bottom of it, right?
But then
yeah.
could you automate that?
Well, right. I mean, could you automate giving estimates or automate filling out a web form and saving it to a database?
Well, yeah. So filling out a web form and saving it to a database. So you could create you create a schema and then create a generator and then write the generator to then produce those things so that you don't have to do that over and over again, right?
Right, exactly.
But
then depending on the situation, you could be like, yeah, I could do it in an hour. Or if it's like, we've got to have this handcrafted drop down of the states and has to behave in this way, and there's got to be flashing animations, like, okay, that's going to take a little bit longer to do. And then, I mean, another thing too is like being able to say, but if you don't need the flashing animations, we can do it in an hour. If you want flashing animations and scratch and sniff plugin, it's going to be like 2 months. Like knowing enough about what you're doing to be able to kind of go into the conversation and say, look, it's going to be a lot. Here's how you can reduce it. Understanding what they're trying to achieve and saying, if you do this later, or this is optional, we'll get to it. We'll try, but maybe if we hold off on this, it'll be easier. Being able to have those conversations can help. Right. But see also the asterisks that I was saying before about trust and understanding software.
Yeah. So the no estimates hashtag, I think, is that it's a hashtag. It's a pithy statement. Like, so what we were saying earlier is like, it can be misinterpreted. But, so I worked, I do work at the company that I think that that hashtag became popular at. But I'll just say that my current job and my previous job, we stopped doing estimates. And so I haven't been working with software estimation for the last 15 years now. So and I'm not a consultant. And so, a lot of the things that I think you're talking about are super relevant, right? But often I'll ask people, if it is something that you can estimate well, right? If programmers automate what they do often, right? And you can estimate things well that you do often. And so, why wouldn't a software developer automate the things that they're estimating regularly? And so I think that estimates inherently limit our ideas of how to improve the system. But I think you made a really good point about seasonal releases. And so, I think at my organization, there's certainly these events where it's like, we need to hit this date. We need something by this date. And being able to do continuous delivery and iterative development, that's all going to be really good. But in your example in the UK, if there was a law that prevented you from doing something that was in your domain, it may be impossible to make that delivery date. It wouldn't matter what software would happen, and you might not discover that until you're in a user testing phase. And so often it's like the unknown unknowns that derail a project. And so you could be really lucky and not have those unknown unknowns hit you. But I think there are these hidden costs to estimates. And so, I do think that, like, I've been working this way for the last 15 years now. So I think there are other experiences. Now, with that said, I do think that there are things that you can say, like, okay, we'll have something, right? And that's just because that you've done it over and over again, and you can stand up something right away, right? Now, is that an estimate? You could argue that it is, because you're saying you can do that because it's repeatable. But even then, the tool that you use might break, right? Or a new version of an operating system might come out. There are all these external factors that might make that item useless. But I think often the things that we do as software developers when we're developing a product, a lot of it is often automatable. And then I think the other piece of automating the estimates is, like, if I like the idea of Monte Carlo simulations, because if you do like sufficient story splitting, then you can model the estimated with a cone of uncertainty, rather than going to developers and asking them how long something's going to take. Because I think often that's not the case. But I don't know, maybe if any of that resonates.
It does. I mean, how the other situation where I get asked, so when I say estimate, I would consider that to be like somebody asking me what is involved in building this thing that I have vaguely just defined, right? So like wanting to know what is needed to do this, including time and people and all that stuff. And so where it came up a lot is someone trying to figure out, like, I've got like 4 initiatives that I've thought about. I want to do some of them. Some of them aren't actually that valuable if they're expensive, but if they're cheap, then they would be good, right? A cost benefit kind of thing. And so they need to know from the engineers, like, what is involved in building this. And so like you can either, like, my experience was, you either give them a sense of it, and it might be small, medium, large, or 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever, but you've got to come up with some sort of sizing, or they will just decide. And so you can't really like insulate yourself from issues. You have to take control of the situation and be like, okay, I'm going to think about these things and tell you, here's what I think is involved in all of these initiatives, and quantify the level of uncertainty as well, and which often requires education. Like, okay, this thing I think, but there's a lot of uncertainty, so I don't know, this thing I think I understand what it is, so I'm a little more confident, blah blah blah. Like, how do you deal with those things if you're not doing estimates? Or am I thinking estimates you are?
Yeah. So what we've done in the past, and what I like to do, and this kind of evolved over time, but is talking about that uncertainty in a very clear way, I think. And so you have known unknowns, but a known unknown can be broken down into 3 categories. One is I know that we've never done it before, but somebody else has, or it's proprietary. Like I know we haven't done it, and I know it can be done. Like maybe this team or something. I know we haven't done it, but it's been done outside of our company by somebody else. And then, which might be like an R&D catch-up sort of thing. Or I have never heard of anybody doing that before, right? And those are 3 very different like styles of unknown. Yeah. And then you're going to discover things as you go, but keeping track of the known unknowns and the cost of delay. And so you can often, another one of the pithy statements is, it's in the doing of the work that you discover the work that you need to do. And so often those new unknowns can be even bigger. But what I've seen companies do often, because it sounds like you had a very healthy situation there, but if it was going off the rails and you discovered something that would be impossible to do you think that would have turned against you, right? Because that estimate could have been just a double-edged sword, right? It could be they have the idea to do all that marketing, they prep the marketing. While they're prepping the marketing, you either succeed at your estimate or you fail at it, and then that marketing, so did doing the estimate actually help at all or not? It might have just been that there was, you just had a good moment where that known unknown didn't get revealed. And so what I've seen on the other hand, though, is when those failures do happen, lots of investment goes into marketing something that the company won't have. And so I have been, I think in the last, in the 2 times that I've been at a company while they've abandoned estimates, it's always been around an emergency. And it's usually been, they made an estimate and then it went really bad. And then it transitioned into a mode of delivery where it was continuous delivery, don't sell what you don't have. And so the marketing push would just happen after. And so, there are ways to think about it that way, but opportunity cost is going to be there, and then yes, there's like really big ideas and how to get to them, but often the highest cost of delay items in a company will be really obvious about whether or not you should be estimating. But so the no estimates hashtag I really think of as doing same sizing for stories, and then doing continuous delivery on a Kanban, and not necessarily like abandon all estimates. But I think estimates and deadlines are also very different things, right?
Yeah. I wish we had more time, because that gets at exactly what we were just talking about with the Agile stuff. Because this UK project that I was mentioning, like, we did break it up into stories, and we did do continuous delivery, and we did every week. And like, part of the promise of me saying, I can't estimate, I can't tell you with certainty, but we'll do our best, was every week I would say, this is what we got done, here's how we're tracking. And if we're looking like it's not going to happen, have a real conversation about that in advance. And like that has to be part of it. And I sort of felt at the end of it that it was like, okay, I can either have a deadline given to me or I can have control over that deadline. If the vibe is there has to be a deadline, right? If someone's expecting something on some date, I need to take control of that situation as much as I can to make sure it's reasonable. And yeah, so I will say though, a lot of things at Stitch Fix did not have estimates either, because it was sort of like, this is viewed as not a huge project. We would like it to be done. We don't care if it is done in a day or a week or a month, just do it next. There was a lot of that, which was good, because I cannot imagine sitting down and planning poker, estimating all of that. That sounds like a nightmare. So yeah, I think this definitely is in that bucket of like, the two words maybe mean something different to different people, but like underneath those words, that makes a lot of sense.
I think the hashtag is for, honestly, is probably for people that are in organizations where estimates are required for everything.
Yeah.
And that's very different than optional estimates, right? So I think hashtag optional estimates might have a different ring to it, because maybe, that means that the product owner would choose to have estimates every time, and then you'd have required.
Why wouldn't they? Yeah.
And so, but yeah, so I definitely think there's certainly nuance there. But I do think that expanding on and having the conversation shift to the known unknowns and where the uncertainty is, as well as continuous delivery and showing regular progress, both of those things are, because like legal discovery or discovery around technology, those things are where like the big nuggets of value come from, and you get yourself in a really bad spot by giving an optimistic estimate about something that has a key element that you don't control, and then all of a sudden there's a catastrophe happening instead. So
Cool. Well, we are coming up on time, and maybe there should be a part 2 to continue this. Sorry, Dave. But
all right. I'm glad we talked about it. It all fit in the theme. So
yes, it did fit well in the theme. It was almost like it turned out to be one of those aphorisms that can be misunderstood. And so I think the thing for me that I'll add in before I kick it to you, Dave, for the last word, and then we close, is I think there are different ways to handle the subject with different terminology, right? There's ways you can say it where it's very jarring and everyone is highly offended. And then there's ways where you just shift the conversation to, what kind of work are we doing? How much uncertainty is there? What's the best way to handle this uncertainty? What are things we can budget? Is it time or money, or, and that kind of stuff? And what bet do we want to make, and things like that. And so there can be very jarring ways to have this conversation, or there can be very unjarring ways. And so that might be part of the nuance as well. But we are at time. And so is there anything you'd like to share or plug before we close, Dave?
I've written a few technical books that don't have much to do with this. I did write a book called Solid is Not Solid. It's $5. It is full of bad language and rants about these solid principles, and covers a lot of what we've talked about here in a sort of irreverent, humorous fashion. So I'll that's always a good one. And that's $5, so you can't feel ripped off for $5. So
nice. Only $5, folks. You heard it here. Awesome. Well, Dave, this has been a really fun conversation. Maybe we should do it again sometime. And to our audience, please do all the YouTube things, like and subscribe and comment and share. We in all honesty, we really do love hearing your feedback, and we love hearing your thoughts, your opinions, what you agree with, what you disagree with, follow-up questions. All that is very, very good. And until next time, have a good one, everybody, and talk to you later. See ya.
See y'all.
Bye, everybody.